You're not going to use the story, Mr. Scott?
No, sir. This is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
At the beginning of January, a movie was released that maybe some of you saw, though probably not, based on how its figures seem to be doing. It was called Race for Glory, Audi versus Lancia, and it tells the story of the 1983 World Rally Championships. It's not a very good movie, so don't seek it out. If you think that's what I'm about to talk about, you are incorrect. Instead, what I want to talk about is not its quality, but a disclaimer that they add at the end of the movie, just before the final credits, which reads, "The characters and stories told in the film are inspired by true events. However, the content has been freely reworked by the imagination of the authors. The description of the events and characters involved has been dramatised, and some characters and events contained in the film have been created for narrative needs." More specifically, I want to talk about what that attitude means for stories or directors who look to adapt true stories in film going forward. Now, I want to make one thing clear to begin with. I think Race for Glory does deserve some credit for being so open about how it departs from fact. There are plenty of movies based on quote-unquote true stories that offer no such caveats, so I think it's doing a good job there. But as I read the comments online, it became clear to me that despite this caveat, a lot of people who were invested in this story were dissatisfied with a lot of the inaccuracies in the movie. I'm not a car person, I can't claim to know the intimate details of the story that Audi versus Lancia is telling, but by all accounts this is one of the great racing rivalries, and it begs the question why the director Stefano Mordini felt the need to dramatise something that was already so popular and so deeply ingrained in the folklore of the sport. And this got me thinking about what the responsibilities are of a filmmaker when they look to adapt a true story. And to my mind, I think there are two considerations that they need to make. The first is quite simply, how good a story are you telling? Or to put it another way, we're willing to put up with some inaccuracies if the end result is awesome. If you need to spice up reality a little bit to tell a compelling story, I think that's probably understandable so long as you're keeping the core facts straight. And I think Audi versus Lancia falls into this category, although I don't know if it really captures anything compelling, to be honest. Though I would still argue why, if you are attracted to telling a story or writing a story or adapting it, you would find the need to change it at all. Like, if the story you're telling needs to be changed, is it that good to begin with? And I think that's a question that a lot of the directors of these kinds of movies need to ask themselves. More specifically, I think they need to ask themselves to what extent do they bear a responsibility to convey the facts of a given situation accurately. Now, I think if you are telling the story of still living people, as Audi versus Lancia is, you do have a responsibility to keep the facts straight. I think you owe it to the people whose stories you're telling and the lives of anyone you could affect by retelling the story to represent the facts correctly or not at all. Though I would say that they're probably allowed some dramatic license. You've got to give them a bit just to, tweak things for stuff like pacing or dramatic decisions or impetus or whatever. Otherwise you're effectively just making a documentary at that point. But I think the water starts to get muddy when we deal with people who are no longer alive, because at that point you're not just dealing with the facts of their story, you're dealing with the legacy of those people, something that has built up often after they've died and has been built up by people other than themselves. At the point that you're adapting a story like that, you are effectively choosing to either contribute to the mythos around a famous historical figure or challenging it. And I do use the term mythos very deliberately there, because while the facts surrounding historical figures, particularly those in more recent history, are pretty static and agreed upon, the wider sort of social folklore that contributes to that mythos often isn't. It's a organic thing that cleanses itself of nuance and sometimes of its darker aspects as time passes, like George Washington chopping down cherry trees, or Winston Churchill's legacy in the UK conveniently never mentioning what he got up to in Ireland. And so by choosing to either support or challenge that mythos, that folklore, a filmmaker is effectively taking on the responsibility of helping to shape the public perception of that character or those characters. Take, for instance, Mel Gibson's Braveheart. Now, in Mel Gibson's defense, which is not a sentence I particularly enjoy saying, Braveheart never claims to be historically accurate. It pulls in real characters and real events into a historical fantasy, but it never actually says it's not accurate either. So that kind of leaves it in this weird grey middle ground where you can't really be sure unless you do some further reading into it, which most people aren't going to do. And it was popular enough that it actively shaped or misaligned, I guess, lots of people's perceptions of those actual events. Now, in the case of Braveheart, the facts underpinning that story never changed. Like, Robert the Bruce was still the guy he was, William Wallace was still the guy he was, Edward Longshanks was, I think that was his name, was still the guy he was. But the perception of those facts had been altered by the movie, and in doing so, the facts had been watered down. Their importance had been diminished because people didn't believe them to be true anymore, or didn't know them anymore, I guess. And I think Braveheart is maybe not the best example of this because it's kind of so ridiculous that it's obvious. There's obviously an element of fantasy to it. But when you're engaging in the tweaking or outright changing of history like that, you run the risk of depicting or whitewashing characters who should really be remembered, warts and all, like, with the bad parts, and depicting them as something that's far more digestible for a Hollywood audience. And that's a risky road to go down. Now, in the case of Audi versus Lancia, I think most of the inaccuracies tend to be sort of mechanical details and race results and maybe a few characters inserted into the story. But I don't think it commits any truly heinous acts of revision of the actual story. So it has that going for it. And fortunately for Mordini, while he has made a movie that traffics in some popular inaccuracies, like apparently the whole thing about Lancia not having enough models of the car that they made for that championship in 1983 and driving the inspectors between two car parks, that's not really based in fact at all. So they traffic in that kind of stuff, but I don't actually think their movie is popular enough that it's really going to have any kind of worrying cultural impact. But what do you do when the movie is popular, where the number of people going to see it is high enough that you feel the need to challenge the inaccuracies in a movie? Well, we saw one example last year with Ridley Scott's Napoleon, which was a fairly average historical epic that nonetheless dominated the trades for several weeks around its release back in November 2023. And a big reason for that was because Ridley Scott, the director, engaged in a war of words with a number of historians who pointed out the inaccuracies in the movie. Now, to be fair to Scott, a lot of those criticisms were your kind of standard internet kind of very light discourse about things, just designed to generate engagement more than actually like really trying to drill into the inaccuracies of the movie. So it was stuff like Napoleon shooting at the pyramids or being present at Marie Antoinette's execution, which are both elements of the movie that aren't accurate, but you can kind of forgive them as being kind of shorthand ways to expeditiously establish a tone or a theme, but they don't really change your perception of the larger events, so they're kind of forgivable. I give Ridley Scott a pass for those, which is just as well, because the last thing I need is an 85-year-old legend of cinema telling me to get a life, which he did with pretty much all of those historians. But it's the other stuff, much of which was just omitted entirely, that I have more of an issue with, and which I think a lot of those historians had an issue with as well. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying that Napoleon the movie covers a 30-year period of history, and even at 157 minutes long, it's a big ask to cover everything that Napoleon got up to in that period. You're going to miss some stuff out, I understand that. But just as we can forgive Ridley Scott for tweaking the facts a little bit to speed up the establishing of a tone or a theme, like the aforementioned Napoleon shooting at the pyramids, which is used to kind of establish that he has no respect for prestige other than his own, we can also criticise Scott for choosing not to do that when he could have, particularly when it would have established some pretty important aspects of his character. For instance, the entire conquest of the Iberian Peninsula is never mentioned, to my knowledge. I didn't hear it. Maybe it was mentioned once in like a throwaway line or something like that. But it's not really dwelled on. And I understand why, on the face of it, because in terms of manpower, it was a relatively minor conflict, certainly compared to something like Le Grand Armée invading Russia. But for a movie that is sort of struggling to find what it's about for a lot of its runtime, and eventually lands on this ham-fisted, "oh, this is the human cost of Napoleon's wars" message, it's very strange to just avoid talking about a conflict that has some really clear examples of what the human cost of those wars was. More specifically, it would have established what happened to the countries that were occupied by Imperial France, particularly when they resisted, which is to say that they were violently suppressed. There are lots of examples of Spanish guerrillas taking French soldiers hostage, and the French army responded by kidnapping the families of the guerrillas and then shooting them should anything happen to the soldiers. But even more damning than not talking about the violent suppression of resistance in occupied territories is the film's reluctance, or outright refusal, to be honest, to ever talk about Napoleon's role in slavery. In 1794, France, now a republic after the revolution, abolished slavery in all of its territories. And then a few years later, Napoleon, as the first consul of the republic, would change the abolition. That was in 1802. And it would remain legal to own and trade slaves in France and her territories until 1848, so for another 46 years, making France the only country, to my knowledge, that abolished slavery and then legalised it again. Now, for a movie whose focus seems to be on the juxtaposition between Napoleon the general and Napoleon the man, omitting arguably the worst thing he ever did seems to be a big misstep, so much so that it almost feels like it was calculated. Napoleon is a grand figure with a legacy that is clearly quite difficult to capture on film, as evidenced by the fact that no one's really managed it. Possibly Abel Gance in the 20s, but that's it. There have been polls in France that suggest that he's still viewed very, very positively today, and his entire life and career has been captured in the most lavish of artworks, and his military genius is the subject of numerous academic careers. In short, he doesn't need any help maintaining his position as a great man of history. And I want to be clear here as well, this is not an attempt to retroactively cancel Napoleon. He was a complicated man who has to be viewed in the context of the times in which he lived. Even if we do that, I think he had as much about him that was bad as was good, but drawing moral absolute judgments about him is not my goal, nor do I think should it be the goal of anyone who wishes to discuss him. I think he has to be viewed with, all of the aspects of his character in place. And I think that's one of the big reasons why I was so disappointed with Napoleon, because Ridley Scott, in choosing to ignore a lot of the darker aspects of his character, has essentially made propaganda. He's essentially contributed quite significantly, given this is the biggest budget movie about Napoleon, to my knowledge, ever. He has contributed to the whitewashing of his legacy. And perhaps even worse than that, is that he spent a lot of time around the release of his movie actively lumping all criticisms of historical inaccuracies together. So he was equating some armchair historian on TikTok saying that Marie Antoinette should have had short hair at her execution, with people pointing out that the harshest thing his movie has to say about his violent, slavery-endorsing main character is that he was kind of a weird guy, which is... It's so clearly missing the point that it almost feels like it was deliberate. And I'm not trying to be a backseat scriptwriter here either. I do know that if Ridley Scott had included these aspects of Napoleon's character that I'm talking about, the tone of the movie he was making would have been very different. But maybe it should have been different if omitting them, or if getting the tone that he wanted to strike meant omitting them. It goes back to what we were saying before. Should a director be allowed to omit the more abhorrent details about a character they want to tell the story of in order to keep the tone light, as Scott does with Napoleon? What is the responsibility of the director, of the storyteller? And I think in Scott's case here, he's made his position on that perfectly clear. His responsibility, first and foremost, is to deliver an entertaining movie that he's pulling from reality and effectively claiming that this is a true story while misleading the audience is irrelevant to him. The last thing Napoleon needed was to be let off lightly, which is unequivocally what the movie does for him. It makes him look like kind of a weird guy, and that's the worst thing about him, apparently. But I think the greatest irony of Scott's movie and the mediocrity of it is that it's so unevenly paced and the screenplay is so confused about how it wants to depict him that it makes him look far better than he was as a human, but also makes him look far worse than he was at the one thing he was exceptional at, which is waging war. So in many ways, the saving grace of Ridley Scott's movie might be its mediocrity, because it's so clearly wrong about a lot of things about Napoleon that hopefully no one takes it seriously. But I do want to change tact for a second here and say that when you're approaching a movie, a historical movie, or a movie based on a true story, I think there is an element of responsibility on the audience as well. I don't want this to just be a takedown of Ridley Scott. I do think the audience has to bring some knowledge of the subject matter to bear and shouldn't just rely on the storyteller to inform them. And I think that was never clearer than in 1967 when Mel Brooks made The Producers. It's a movie that doesn't feel the need to go over all the horrible things the Nazis did. It assumes the audience know why the Nazis were bad and instead devotes its time to being very funny. I think Taika Waititi tried something similar with Jojo Rabbit more recently, where it depicts the Nazis as ripe subjects for criticism and for satire. Now, particularly in Jojo Rabbit, Taika Waititi's own performance as an imaginary friend who is Hitler is clearly supposed to be an area of ridicule, or a means to ridicule the Nazis through this character and show how ridiculous they are. And I suppose if we're giving Scott his a fair shake, we could potentially say that his depiction of Napoleon as this kind of weird guy is maybe him attempting to establish some kind of shorthand that he's a figure who's maybe not deserving of respect and should instead be ridiculed. I don't think it works very well. Certainly not as well as Jojo Rabbit, which is not a movie I particularly like anyway. And there are clearly levels to the expectation of audience knowledge on a subject as well. I think expecting European and American audiences to know about the Nazis, a subject that is taught in literally every school in most countries in Europe and North America, is pretty reasonable. Certainly more reasonable than expecting them to know biographic details of a single man who died 200 years ago. And more to the point, The Producers encapsulates its mockery of the Nazis within a musical. It's not trying to depict a true story, it elevates it to something else. And likewise, Jojo Rabbit is elevated into the realm of farce. There aren't real characters in it, and that means it doesn't get bogged down in trying to depict a true story or depict the reality of living in Nazi Germany. It does a little bit, but not that much, which I think is a wise choice. I think it should have done more of that. One gets the sense that when he was making Napoleon, Ridley Scott was interested in two things. One is the enormous battle scenes, which over the last 25 years, Ridley Scott has become an expert at depicting. And the other is that Napoleon, while incredibly gifted at the art of warfare, was a ripe subject for satire. And I think that's a promising start. I think that Ridley Scott had good intentions when it came to his approach to this character. But I think the fact that Joaquin Phoenix's performance as Napoleon approaches caricature is actually potentially the movie's greatest failing. Because while it is unflinching in its mockery of Napoleon, it's not doing it for the right reasons. It doesn't even tell you what the right reasons are. So what you're left with is the admittedly very funny, but ultimately weightless scene of a weird guy making funny noises as he crawls on hands and knees towards his wife's vagina under a dinner table. And all you're left as an audience with after that scene finishes is the surrealism of it, and you laugh because it is surreal. But you're not laughing because of the schadenfreude of watching a not very nice person being taken down a peg or two. The battle sequences of Napoleon are stunning, but they aren't particularly accurate. Napoleon leads cavalry charges, wades into the fray personally, and everything is shot with an eye for the cinematic of the battle. But I can forgive the movie that. Translating the machinations of a battlefield to the screen is something Ridley Scott is exceptional at, and I'm not going to criticise him for changing a few things to make it work. But I don't believe Ridley Scott should be let off the hook for failing almost completely to explore Napoleon as a character. His defence seems to be, it's just a movie, but those who forget the mistakes of the past are doomed to repeat them. And Ridley Scott had an opportunity here to tell a new generation of moviegoers about the mistakes of the past. And in choosing instead to omit them from what will be many people's only filmic exposure to Napoleon the character outside of fucking Bill and Ted, Ridley Scott has actively contributed to people forgetting the bad things he did, forgetting the mistakes of the past. Ridley Scott doesn't get to hide behind our first point of consideration for Napoleon. His movie isn't entertaining enough to justify the inaccuracies in it. And that means that his willingness to contort the facts of history to try and make an entertaining movie are both unsuccessful and misguided. With this movie, Scott has contributed to the propaganda surrounding Napoleon's character, and he hasn't even had the decency to do it well. And I think that's tragic.